Imagine stepping into a world you already recognize, even if you have never truly seen it. Towering dinosaurs move through dense green forests, their footsteps heavy, their presence constant. The air feels thick, the ground alive with danger, and every moment carries a quiet tension, as if survival itself is always uncertain. This is the Jurassic world most people know, not from memory, but from stories repeated so often they begin to feel like truth. It is a world shaped slowly over time, built from museum halls, illustrated books, and films that turned fragments of evidence into complete scenes. Each generation added something new, refining the image until it felt stable, almost finished, as though nothing more needed to be asked. The dinosaurs became familiar figures, their movements predictable, their world fully formed in the imagination. And yet, something about this vision remains strangely smooth. It flows together without resistance, as if the past arranged itself neatly for us to understand. The forests always appear dense, the predators always ready, the world always alive with movement. But reality rarely holds itself so cleanly, and history, especially one buried this deeply, does not often present itself in such complete forms. What we are seeing is not the Jurassic as it was, but the Jurassic as it has been reconstructed, shaped by choices, interpretations, and the limits of what could be known. Every bone discovered had to be placed, every gap quietly filled, every movement imagined from stillness. Over time, these decisions settled into something that feels certain, even though it was never complete to begin with. There is a quiet assumption beneath it all, one that rarely gets noticed, that what we have built from fragments must somehow resemble the whole. That enough pieces, arranged carefully, can recreate a world exactly as it once existed. It feels reasonable, almost inevitable, and yet it carries a subtle risk, the risk of mistaking familiarity for accuracy. Because the truth may not lie in what is clearly shown, but in what remains just outside the frame. The details that were never preserved, the environments that left no trace, the behaviors that vanished without imprint. They do not appear in the familiar image, yet they may have shaped it more than anything we can now see. Slowly, the picture begins to shift. Not in dramatic ways, but in subtle adjustments that change how it feels. The certainty softens, just enough to let doubt enter. The world remains recognizable, but no longer complete. It becomes something else, something unfinished, something still forming beneath the surface of what we think we know. And in that quiet space, a different question begins to take shape. Not whether the Jurassic world existed, but whether the version we hold in our minds is only a simplified reflection of something far more complex. A shadow that feels solid until you look closely enough to see where it begins to blur. The scene does not disappear. It lingers, calm and familiar, but no longer unquestioned. And as that quiet uncertainty settles, attention begins to shift downward, toward the ground beneath it, toward the fragments that made this image possible, and the possibility that those fragments may be telling a quieter, more complicated story than the world we thought we understood. Beneath the surface of every reconstruction lies a deeper silence, one that does not announce itself, but remains present in every unanswered space. It is not empty, but filled with possibilities that never fully take shape. The fossils that form this world are only moments captured by chance, preserved under conditions so specific they exclude far more than they reveal. What remains is enough to guide us, but never enough to complete the story. And so the image we carry forward is both real and incomplete, a careful construction balanced between discovery and imagination, waiting quietly for the moment when we begin to question it again, and follow that question into whatever truth might still be hidden beneath it, waiting to be. Beneath the image we have come to trust, there is something quieter, something far less complete. It rests in stone, hidden within layers of earth that have carried time forward without explanation. These are the fossils, the fragments we rely on to understand a world that no longer exists, and yet they do not speak as clearly as we often imagine. A fossil is not a preserved moment in full, but a rare accident. It forms only when conditions align with unusual precision, when a creature is buried quickly enough, when decay is slowed, when pressure and minerals replace what once was alive. Most life does not leave this kind of trace. It disappears entirely, returning to the cycle without leaving a record behind. What remains, then, is not a complete archive, but a scattered collection of survivals. Bones endure where soft tissues vanish. Shapes remain where colors are lost. Movement, sound, behavior, the subtle interactions that define life, all dissolve without imprint. The fossil captures structure, but not experience. It tells us that something existed, but not how it lived, how it moved through its world, or how that world truly felt. And so, every discovery carries two meanings at once. It reveals and it withholds. A skeleton can suggest size, posture, and possibility, but it cannot fully restore the creature it once supported. There are always spaces left behind, silent gaps that no fossil can fill. Into those spaces, interpretation begins. Scientists study these remains with care, comparing them to living animals, examining the environment in which they were found, building connections between what is known and what must be inferred. It is a process grounded in evidence, yet shaped by absence. Each reconstruction becomes a careful balance between what can be proven and what must be imagined. There is a quiet pattern within this process, something that often goes unnoticed. Fossils do not form everywhere. They require specific conditions, certain types of sediment, particular environments where preservation is possible. Rivers, floodplains, shallow seas, these become the places where the past lingers. But vast regions leave nothing behind. Forests may vanish without a trace, entire ecosystems dissolving without ever becoming part of the record. This is the hidden structure beneath our understanding, a form of selection that is not intentional, but inevitable. Only certain lives, in certain places, at certain moments, are carried forward. Everything else is lost. Not because it was less important, but because it did not meet the conditions required to remain. The result is a picture that feels complete, but is built from fragments chosen by circumstance. We begin to see patterns, to recognize species, to map entire environments, yet all of it rests on a foundation that is uneven and incomplete. The Jurassic world as we know it is not a full reconstruction, but a reflection shaped by what happened to survive. And within that realization, something begins to shift. The fossils no longer feel like answers, but like questions. Each one points not only to what existed, but to everything that did not remain. The silence between them grows more noticeable, more significant, as if it carries its own form of meaning. What we are looking at is not the Jurassic world itself, but the portion of it that endured long enough to be found. A version shaped by survival, not by totality. It feels solid, yet it is defined as much by absence as by presence. As this understanding settles, the fragments begin to take on a different role. They are no longer endpoints, but starting points. Clues that must be arranged, interpreted, and extended beyond what they directly show. And from this quiet, incomplete foundation, a larger effort begins to emerge. The attempt to rebuild an entire world from pieces that were never meant to form a whole. From fragments buried in stone, a larger vision begins to take shape. Bones are measured, compared, and arranged, each one placed with careful intention, as if assembling a puzzle that was never complete to begin with. This is where the Jurassic world is rebuilt, not as it was found, but as it is interpreted, piece by piece, through methods that attempt to bridge the distance between what remains and what once existed. A single fossil rarely stands alone. It is studied alongside others, compared to living animals, examined within the context of the environment in which it was discovered. The shape of a limb may suggest how it moved. The structure of teeth may hint at what it consumed. Surrounding rock layers may reveal the climate it lived within. Slowly, these clues begin to connect, forming outlines that feel increasingly solid. Yet, even as the image sharpens, it remains dependent on choice. There is no direct way to observe the creature in motion, no preserved moment that shows exactly how it behaved or interacted with its surroundings. Scientists must decide how to extend the evidence, how to move from structure to function, from form to life. These decisions are guided by knowledge, but they are still interpretations, shaped by what seems most consistent with what is known. Modern animals often serve as references, offering glimpses into how similar structures might operate. A bird's movement may inform how a dinosaur balanced. A reptile's behavior may suggest patterns of activity or rest. These comparisons help fill the gaps, yet they also introduce a subtle influence, the tendency to see the past through the lens of the present. Geological context adds another layer. the arrangement of continents, the presence of water, the composition of the atmosphere all contribute to the reconstruction of entire ecosystems. Climate models extend this further, estimating temperature, rainfall, and seasonal patterns. From these elements, forests are imagined, coastlines outlined, entire environments brought into view. And still, beneath this careful process, something remains fluid. The image is never final. As new discoveries emerge, details begin to shift. A structure once thought to serve one purpose may be reinterpreted entirely. A species once depicted in a certain way may be redrawn, its posture altered, its appearance reconsidered. The changes are not abrupt, but they are constant, adjusting the picture in ways that are often subtle, yet deeply significant. It becomes possible, then, to hold two different versions of the same creature, each supported by evidence, each shaped by interpretation, yet not identical. One reconstruction replaces another, not because the past has changed, but because understanding has moved forward. What felt certain begins to soften, revealing itself as part of an ongoing process rather than a finished result. The Jurassic world, in this sense, is not something that was simply uncovered and preserved. It is something that continues to be formed, revised, and refined with each new piece of evidence. A mosaic that shifts as new fragments are added, where no single version remains permanent. This does not weaken the picture, but it changes how it is seen. The past becomes less like a fixed scene and more like a landscape viewed through moving light, where details appear, fade, and reappear in different forms. It invites a different kind of attention, one that does not seek final answers, but follows the process of discovery as it unfolds. And as this understanding settles, a quiet question begins to emerge, one that lingers just beneath the surface of everything that has been reconstructed. If the image continues to change, if each version is only a step within a longer process, then how close has any reconstruction come to what truly existed? The world we have rebuilt feels real, yet it is always one interpretation among many. And somewhere beyond these shifting outlines, beyond the careful arrangements of bone and theory, there remains the possibility of a Jurassic world that does not fully align with any version we have created, waiting silently beyond the reach of even our most detailed reconstructions. The creatures we imagine moving through the Jurassic world feel familiar enough to recognize, even when they seem distant and strange. But beneath their presence lies something far more difficult to picture, something that changes the entire meaning of that world. The ground they walked on was not the ground we know. The planet itself was arranged in ways that no longer exist, shaped by forces that moved so slowly they escaped notice, yet never truly stopped. Long before any single creature took its first step, the surface of the Earth was already in motion. Continents were not fixed, coastlines were not stable, and the boundaries we now take for granted had not yet formed. What we call land today was once gathered together in a vast supercontinent, a single mass that held most of the planet's surface within it. This was Pangaea, a world where distances were connected in ways that now feel almost impossible to imagine. But even that unity did not remain. It began to shift, to separate, to open slowly along lines that would one day become oceans. The process was quiet, almost imperceptible, unfolding over millions of years without urgency or interruption. Cracks widened, waters filled the spaces between, and the land that once stood together began to drift apart. From above, if such a view had been possible, the transformation would not have appeared dramatic. There were no sudden breaks, no sharp divisions. Instead, there was a gradual unfolding, a rearrangement so slow it would feel like stillness. And yet, within that stillness, everything was changing. Coastlines formed where none had existed, inland regions became isolated, new seas carried moisture into areas that had once been dry, while other regions began to lose the influence of water entirely. The shape of the land altered the movement of air, redirecting winds, reshaping weather patterns, creating climates that could not exist under the arrangement we know today. The Jurassic world was not simply a place with different life. It was a planet organized under a different structure, where the placement of land and sea influenced every detail that followed. Forests grew where conditions allowed, ecosystems formed within the boundaries created by geography, and the paths of evolution were guided by the separation and connection of continents. What feels stable now was not stable then. The Earth was in the middle of becoming something else, something that had not yet settled into its present form. The familiar outlines of continents had not fully emerged. The distances between them were changing, slowly redefining the relationships between regions, climates, and living systems. It is easy to imagine the Jurassic as a distant version of our current world, a simple replacement of creatures within a familiar setting. But the deeper truth is more unsettling. The stage itself was different. The arrangement of the planet, the flow of oceans, the movement of air, all existed within a configuration that no longer remains. And within that realization, something begins to shift in how the past is understood. The creatures do not stand alone. They are part of a larger system, one shaped by forces that extend far beyond their own existence. Their world was defined not only by what lived within it, but by the structure of the earth beneath them. The slow separation of land continues even now, though it moves beyond what we can easily perceive. The process never ended. It only became less visible, less immediate, fading into the background of what appears to be a stable world. But stability, as the Jurassic reveals, is often only a moment within a much longer transformation. And as the land moved, as oceans opened and climates shifted, another layer of the world began to take shape, one that could not be seen directly, yet influenced everything that lived within it. The air itself began to change, carrying with it the conditions that would define how life breathed, grew, and endured. The land had begun to shift, slowly reshaping the surface of the planet, but another transformation was unfolding at the same time, one that could not be seen, only felt. It existed in the space between everything, filling every movement, surrounding every living form. The air itself was different, not dramatically altered in a way that would be immediately obvious, but changed enough to create a world that would not feel entirely familiar. To breathe in, the Jurassic would not simply be to inhale, as we do now. The composition of the atmosphere carried subtle variations, differences in oxygen and carbon dioxide that quietly influenced how life functioned. These were not extremes that turned the world into something unrecognizable, but shifts that shaped the rhythm of existence in ways that are easy to overlook. Oxygen levels, at certain times, may have been higher than what we experience today. This does not mean the air was easier to breathe in a simple sense, but that the processes within living bodies operated under slightly different conditions. Growth, movement, endurance, all unfolded within an environment that carried more of this essential element. At the same time, carbon dioxide levels were also elevated, creating a balance that supported dense plant life and sustained ecosystems that spread across vast regions. The result was not chaos, but a form of quiet abundance. Vegetation expanded where conditions allowed, forming landscapes that were not necessarily more dangerous, but more continuous. The air carried moisture, warmth, and the chemical balance needed to support life at scales that feel distant when compared to the present. And yet, this difference would not announce itself in obvious ways. There would be no clear moment where one could say the air had changed. Instead, it would be felt gradually, in the way breathing settles into the body, in the way movement responds to the environment, in the way life adapts without needing to question the conditions it exists within. The climate itself reflected this same subtlety. The Jurassic world was, in many ways, warmer, with fewer extremes between regions than we might expect. Polar ice was limited, and the contrast between equatorial and polar environments was less severe than it is today. This created a kind of continuity, a smoother distribution of conditions across the planet. It is easy to imagine the past as a place of constant struggle, where survival required endless effort and danger was always immediate. But the atmosphere suggests something different. A world that, while not without challenge, was not defined by relentless instability. Instead, it held a form of balance, one that allowed life to persist, expand, and adapt over long periods, without constant disruption. This balance does not remove the presence of predation or competition, but it changes how they are understood. They become part of a system that sustains itself, rather than a constant crisis that defines every moment. The air, the climate, the structure of the environment all work together to create conditions where life continues, not in chaos, but in continuity. And within this realization, another quiet shift takes place. The Jurassic world begins to feel less like a place of extremes, and more like a world with its own internal stability, one that operated under rules that differ from those we experience now, but are no less consistent. The difference is not in intensity, but in composition. Not in constant danger, but in subtle variation. The air itself becomes part of the mystery, something that shaped life in ways that cannot be fully seen, only inferred through the traces it left behind. As this atmosphere settles into view, it becomes clear that it did not exist in isolation. It supported entire systems, guided the growth of ecosystems, influenced how life interacted across the planet. And from this unseen layer, a larger picture begins to emerge, one that moves beyond individual creatures and into the structure of the living world itself, revealing patterns that may be far quieter and far more stable than we have been led to imagine. The image most often carried into the Jurassic is one of constant movement and danger, where every moment is defined by pursuit, where survival depends on speed, strength, and timing. Predators appear at the edge of every scene, and the world feels tense, as if life itself exists in a state of continuous conflict. It is a vision that holds attention easily, but it may not be the one that endured. Beneath that familiar intensity lies a quieter structure, one that does not reveal itself immediately. Ecosystems do not function through endless action. They are shaped by balance, by the flow of energy that moves through them in steady patterns. Most life does not exist in the act of hunting or fleeing, but in the spaces between, where time stretches and nothing urgent occurs. In the Jurassic world, herbivores likely formed the majority of visible life, moving through landscapes in search of vegetation that grew in abundance. Their presence would have been constant, not in dramatic motion, but in steady patterns of feeding, resting, and moving again. They defined the rhythm of the environment, not through intensity, but through continuity. Predators, in contrast, would have appeared far less frequently than we imagine. Their existence depended on conserving energy, not expending it without purpose. Hunting is costly, uncertain, and often unsuccessful. Much of their time would have been spent waiting, observing, or simply existing within the same environment, without immediate action. The moments of pursuit, though real, would have been brief, separated by long periods of stillness. This creates a different kind of world, one that does not unfold as a sequence of dramatic encounters, but as a slow and continuous process. The tension we often associate with the Jurassic may not have been constant, but occasional, emerging only at specific moments, rather than defining every second. Energy moves through ecosystems in predictable ways. Plants capture it, herbivores consume it, predators rely on it. But at each stage, most of that energy is lost, dissipated through processes that do not involve conflict. The result is a system where stability is not an exception, but a requirement. Without it, life cannot persist over long periods. The Jurassic world lasted for millions of years, a span of time that suggests not chaos, but endurance. For such a system to remain intact, it must have operated within limits that prevented constant disruption. Balance, not intensity, becomes the underlying condition. This does not remove danger from the world, but it changes its role. Predation becomes part of the system, not its defining feature. It exists alongside long stretches of quiet, where nothing dramatic occurs, where life continues without interruption. And in this quiet, something unexpected begins to take shape. The Jurassic world starts to feel less like a place of constant threat and more like a landscape of continuity, where life unfolds in patterns that repeat, adjust, and persist over time. The difference is subtle, but significant. The focus shifts away from isolated moments of action and toward the broader structure that supports them. It becomes possible to imagine days, even entire lifetimes, passing without dramatic events, where existence is defined by routine rather than urgency. This realization does not diminish the world, but deepens it. It reveals a system that is not driven by chaos, but by stability, where life is sustained through balance rather than constant struggle. The true mystery may not be how dangerous the Jurassic was, but how it maintained itself for so long without collapsing into disorder. And as this quieter vision settles into place, attention begins to move again, away from the structure of the world and toward the life within it. Toward the creatures themselves, not as figures of action, but as living beings shaped by this balance, carrying within them behaviors and forms that may be far more complex and far less familiar than we have been led to believe. The creatures that move through the Jurassic in our imagination feel solid, defined, almost permanent in their form. Their shapes are familiar, their skin smooth, their presence unmistakably reptilian. We recognize them instantly, as if their appearance has always been known, as if there has never been any doubt about what they looked like. But this certainty, like much of what surrounds the Jurassic, rests on a foundation that has quietly shifted. Early reconstructions were guided by what was closest at hand. Modern reptiles became the reference, their scales, their posture, their movements used to fill in what fossils could not reveal. It was a logical choice, a way to extend limited evidence into something visible. And over time, these interpretations settled into a shared image, repeated until it became difficult to imagine anything else. But the fossils did not remain silent. As discoveries continued, new details began to appear, not in dramatic forms at first, but in subtle impressions left behind in stone. Traces of texture, faint outlines that did not match the smooth surfaces we had come to expect. These were not complete images, but they carried suggestions, hints that something more complex had once existed. Feather-like structures emerged from certain fossils, challenging the assumption that dinosaurs were uniformly scaled. Skin impressions revealed patterns, layers, variations that could not be easily explained within the earlier models. The surface of these creatures began to feel less predictable, less aligned with the images we had constructed. And with each new discovery, the familiar form began to soften. The sharp lines of certainty gave way to possibilities that felt less defined, yet more accurate. Dinosaurs were no longer bound to a single appearance. They became varied, textured, shaped by evolutionary paths that did not always align with modern expectations. This shift carries a quiet discomfort. The creatures we thought we knew begin to change, not entirely, but enough to feel unfamiliar. The image remains, but it is no longer stable. It moves, adjusts, reveals details that were not part of the original vision, and in doing so, it asks us to let go of something that once felt certain. Appearance is not a simple detail. It shapes how a creature interacts with its environment. Feathers or filament-like coverings may have influenced temperature regulation, display, even movement. The surface of the body becomes part of its function, not just its form. What once seemed like a minor correction becomes a deeper transformation. Some of the most recognizable dinosaurs may have carried features that would alter their presence entirely. Instead of appearing as purely imposing figures, they may have held elements of softness, complexity, even elegance. Their forms may have been less rigid, less defined by the stark imagery we have inherited. This does not make them less real. It makes them more difficult to simplify. They become less like symbols and more like living organisms, shaped by conditions that do not always align with what we expect to see. And as this new image begins to settle, it becomes clear that what we have been holding on to was never a final version, but a stage within an ongoing process. Each discovery does not replace the past, but refines it, adding layers that move it further away from simplicity. The dinosaurs do not disappear. They remain, but they no longer stand as fixed figures. They shift, quietly, into forms that feel both familiar and unfamiliar at the same time. Recognizable, yet not entirely known. And with this shift, attention begins to move beyond appearance, because if what they look like has changed, then something deeper may also be waiting beneath the surface. Something that cannot be seen directly, but must be understood through patterns, traces, and careful interpretation. The question no longer rests on form alone. It begins to extend into behavior, into how these creatures lived within the world that shaped them. And in that transition, the Jurassic becomes something more than a collection of images. It becomes a place of activity, interaction, and hidden complexity, where what is visible is only the beginning of what can be understood. Once the surface of these creatures begins to change, something deeper follows quietly behind. Appearance gives way to movement, and movement to behavior, yet this is where the record becomes faint. Fossils preserve structure, but they rarely capture life in motion. What remains are traces, scattered and indirect, fragments that suggest activity without fully revealing it. A series of footprints pressed into ancient ground can tell a story, though only in outline. They show direction, spacing, sometimes the presence of more than one individual moving together. From these patterns, a possibility emerges, not of solitary creatures wandering alone, but of groups traveling across the same landscape, their paths aligned in ways that feel intentional. Bone beds offer another glimpse, collections of individuals found together, sometimes of the same species, sometimes of different ages. These arrangements hint at proximity, at lives that may have overlapped rather than remained separate. They do not explain why, but they suggest that connection was not uncommon. Nesting sites carry a quieter message. Clusters of eggs, arranged with care, positioned within environments that would support their survival. These are not random placements. They reflect behavior, decisions made in response to conditions, choices that imply a level of awareness shaped by more than instinct alone. And yet, none of these traces provide a complete picture. They do not show communication, they do not reveal sound, they do not capture the subtle exchanges that define interaction. What they offer is possibility, a framework within which life may have unfolded in ways more complex than we often imagine. It becomes easier, then, to consider that the Jurassic world was not composed of isolated figures moving through empty space, but of communities, shifting and adapting together. Creatures responding not only to their environment, but to each other, forming patterns that extended beyond immediate survival. There may have been periods of quiet coordination, movements that followed shared rhythms rather than constant competition. Groups gathering, dispersing, adjusting to changes in climate, food, or season. These are not dramatic scenes, but they carry a different kind of depth, one that reflects continuity rather than conflict. The absence of direct evidence does not erase these possibilities. Instead, it defines the limits within which they can be understood. Behavior exists at the edge of what fossils can reveal, always present but never fully captured. It must be inferred, carefully, from what little remains. Modern animals provide reference points, not as exact comparisons, but as reminders that complex behavior does not require visibility in the fossil record. Social structures, care for offspring, communication through sound or movement, these are common across many forms of life today. It would not be unusual for similar patterns to have existed in the past, even if they left no direct trace behind. This introduces a quiet shift in how the Jurassic world is imagined. It becomes less about individual creatures and more about interactions, less about isolated moments and more about ongoing processes. Life begins to feel continuous, shaped by relationships that extend beyond what can be easily observed. And within this continuity, a different kind of world takes form. One where not every moment is defined by threat, where routine and adaptation guide behavior, where survival is not only about avoidance and pursuit, but about fitting into a system that remains stable over time. The most important aspects of this world may never be seen directly. They exist in the spaces between fossils, in the patterns that can only be suggested, not confirmed. And yet, they may have defined the experience of life more than anything that was preserved. As this hidden dimension settles into view, the focus begins to widen. The creatures we have followed are only part of a larger system, one that extends far beyond them. The Jurassic world was not shaped by dinosaurs alone, but by countless forms of life that rarely enter the image at all, waiting quietly at the edges of our attention. As the focus lingers on dinosaurs, something quieter remains just beyond the edge of attention, a vast presence that rarely takes center stage, yet shapes everything within it. The Jurassic world was not built around a single group of creatures, no matter how large or visually striking they may have been. It was layered, intricate, sustained by countless forms of life that moved unnoticed through the same landscapes. The forests themselves carried much of this hidden weight. Long before any large creature passed through them, plants defined the structure of the environment. Towering conifers, spreading ferns, and ancient cycads formed dense networks of growth, shaping light, moisture, and space. These were not passive backdrops, but active systems, influencing where life could exist and how it could move. Within these forests, smaller forms of life worked continuously, often unseen. Insects moved through leaves and soil, feeding, breaking down organic material, shaping cycles that allowed the environment to renew itself. Their presence was constant, though rarely preserved, and yet they carried a role as essential as any larger creature. Without them, the system would not sustain itself. Closer to the ground, early mammals lived in quiet contrast to the giants above them. Small, often hidden, they moved through shadows, adapting to a world where visibility could mean vulnerability. Their existence was not marked by dominance, but by persistence, finding ways to survive within the spaces left open by larger forms of life. Beyond the land, the oceans held entirely different systems, vast and complex in ways that remain only partially understood. Marine reptiles moved through waters that connected distant regions, while smaller organisms formed the foundation of aquatic life. The surface and the depths were linked through processes that mirrored those on land, yet unfolded in environments far removed from what we can easily imagine. All of these layers existed at the same time, overlapping, interacting, shaping one another in ways that do not always leave clear evidence behind. The Jurassic world was not a stage set for dinosaurs alone, but a network of relationships that extended far beyond any single group. And yet, memory has narrowed this complexity into something more focused, more selective. The largest creatures, the most visible forms, have come to represent the whole, while the systems that supported them remain in the background, often overlooked. This creates a subtle distortion, one that simplifies the past into something easier to recognize, but less complete. It becomes possible to imagine the Jurassic as a place defined by a few dominant figures, rather than a balanced system where no single element existed in isolation. The truth feels quieter, but more expansive. Dinosaurs were part of the world, not its center. Their lives were shaped by the plants they consumed, the environments they moved through, the smaller organisms that maintained the conditions necessary for survival. Nothing existed alone, and nothing remained unaffected by the presence of everything else. As this broader view settles, the world begins to feel different. Less like a collection of isolated scenes, and more like a continuous system, where each part influences the whole. The complexity does not overwhelm, but deepens the sense of reality, replacing simplicity with connection. And within that connection, a new kind of question begins to emerge. Not just what existed, but how these systems functioned together, how they remained stable, how they adapted over time without collapsing into disorder. Because even with this wider perspective, something remains uncertain. The patterns are visible, but not fully understood. The relationships are suggested, but not entirely clear. And as the full ecosystem comes into view, it reveals not just complexity, but a deeper mystery, one that extends beyond what can be easily explained, waiting quietly within the balance of a world that no longer exists. Beneath the living surface of the Jurassic world, beyond the movement of creatures and the growth of forests, there existed a quieter rhythm, one that did not reveal itself in moments, but in patterns stretched across immense spans of time. It was not something that could be seen directly, not something that unfolded within a single lifetime. It moved slowly, shaping the world in ways that were almost impossible to notice as they occurred. The planet was never still. Even when everything appeared stable, subtle changes were always underway. Sea levels rose and fell, not abruptly, but gradually, shifting the boundaries between land and water. Regions that were once submerged emerged over time, while others slowly disappeared beneath expanding seas. These movements were not sudden events, but extended processes, unfolding with a quiet persistence. Climate followed similar patterns. Temperatures shifted, moisture levels adjusted, and ecosystems responded in ways that reflected these changes. Yet these adjustments did not happen quickly enough to create immediate disruption. They unfolded over such long durations that life had time to adapt, to move, to shift alongside the changing conditions without collapse. These cycles are not obvious when viewed from within them. They do not announce themselves with clear beginnings or endings. Instead, they leave traces behind, subtle markers embedded within the earth itself. Layers of rock record the passage of time, each one carrying chemical signatures that reflect the conditions under which it formed. Fossils appear and disappear across these layers, mapping changes in distribution that hint at shifting environments. To uncover these patterns requires patience, a careful reading of what remains. No single layer tells the full story. It is only when they are placed together, compared across distances and depths, that the rhythm begins to emerge. A pattern of repetition, of rise and fall, of adjustment without sudden break. What becomes clear is that the Jurassic world was not a fixed environment, but one in constant motion. Not in the dramatic sense we often imagine, but in a steady progression that reshaped the planet over time. The changes were real, yet they were rarely immediate. They did not disrupt life entirely, but guided it, influencing how it evolved and where it could exist. This introduces a different way of seeing change. Instead of sharp transitions, there is continuity. Instead of sudden transformation, there is gradual adjustment. The world did not shift from one state to another in clear steps, but moved through phases that blended into one another, creating a sense of ongoing balance. And within this balance, life found ways to persist. Species adapted to new conditions, ecosystems adjusted their structure, and the overall system remained intact. The cycles did not destroy the world, but shaped it, providing the conditions under which it could continue. This quiet stability carries its own kind of mystery. It suggests that the most significant changes were not the ones that drew attention, but those that unfolded too slowly to be noticed. The world was always becoming something else, yet never so quickly that it lost its continuity. As this rhythm settles into view, it becomes possible to feel the scale of time in a different way. Not as a sequence of events, but as a flow, a continuous process that moves forward without interruption. The Jurassic world was part of this flow, shaped by cycles that extended far beyond any single moment. And as these cycles begin to take form, another layer of understanding starts to emerge. Because the patterns that shaped the environment did not remain separate from life itself. They influenced it, guided it, and in doing so, played a role in how it changed over time. The question that follows is not simply how the world shifted, but how life responded to those shifts, how these slow, persistent cycles became part of the process that shaped the forms and behaviors that would define the Jurassic world in ways that are only now beginning to be understood. When we think of evolution, it often appears as something dramatic, a sequence of transformations where one form becomes another in ways that feel visible and distinct. The image is familiar, creatures shifting rapidly, features changing in clear steps, as though time itself moves in sudden bursts of innovation. But the deeper rhythm of evolution does not always follow this pattern. It can move quietly, almost invisibly, unfolding in ways that do not announce themselves as change at all. In the Jurassic world, many forms of life may have remained outwardly similar for long stretches of time. Their shapes stable, their movements consistent, their presence blending seamlessly into the environments they inhabited. And yet, beneath that stability, small adjustments were taking place, changes so gradual that they would not be recognized within a single lifetime. These changes did not need to be dramatic to be meaningful. A slight variation in structure, a subtle shift in behavior, a minor adjustment in how a creature interacted with its surroundings, each one carried forward through generations, accumulating slowly. Over time, these small differences could lead to outcomes that, when viewed across vast spans, appear significant, even transformative. But from within the process itself, there is no clear moment where one form becomes another, no boundary that marks the transition. The change is continuous, blending past and present into a single flow that does not pause or separate into distinct phases. This creates a different way of understanding evolution, one that does not rely on visible shifts, but on continuity. Entire ecosystems may evolve in this manner, maintaining their overall structure while adjusting to new conditions in subtle ways. The surface appears stable, even unchanging, while the underlying processes continue to reshape life in quiet, persistent ways. It becomes possible, then, for a world to transform without ever appearing entirely different. Forests remain forests, creatures retain familiar forms, and yet the relationships between them, the details of their structure, the balance of their interactions, all continue to adjust. The change is real, but it does not disrupt the sense of continuity. This challenges the expectation that evolution must always be noticeable. It suggests that the most important transformations may occur without drawing attention, unfolding beneath the surface of what we can easily observe. The difference between one moment and the next may seem negligible, but across millions of years, those differences accumulate into something entirely new. There is a quiet paradox within this idea. Change is constant, yet it often appears absent. Stability is not the absence of evolution, but the result of it operating in a way that preserves continuity while allowing adaptation. Life does not always reinvent itself in visible ways. It refines itself, adjusting to the conditions it encounters. In the Jurassic world, this kind of evolution would have allowed systems to remain intact over long periods. Instead of sudden disruption, there is gradual alignment, where life and environment move together, shaping each other without breaking the overall structure. And as this perspective settles, the nature of transformation begins to feel different. It is no longer something that happens in clear moments, but something that is always happening, even when it cannot be seen. The world changes, not through abrupt shifts, but through continuous adjustment. This realization opens another layer of complexity. If evolution can proceed without obvious signs, then the boundaries we draw between one state and another may be less defined than we assume. What appears as a stable world may, in fact, be in the process of becoming something else entirely. And from this quiet understanding, another question begins to emerge. If change does not always look like change, then perhaps the same is true for endings. Perhaps what we call extinction, what we see as disappearance, may not always be as clear or final as it appears, but part of a process that continues beyond what we can easily recognize. When the story of the Jurassic is told, it often moves toward endings as if they were clear, defined points in time. A species appears. It exists, and then it disappears, its absence marked as a conclusion. This way of seeing the past feels natural, shaped by how we understand beginnings and endings in our own lives. But the deeper record suggests something far less distinct, something that does not divide so easily. Extinction, as it is often imagined, carries a sense of finality, a moment where life stops, where a form vanishes completely. Yet in reality, this process rarely unfolds in a single instant. It stretches across time, moving gradually, sometimes unevenly, leaving traces that do not always align into a clear narrative. A population may begin to decline, not suddenly, but in subtle ways. Numbers decrease, ranges shrink, conditions shift. Some groups persist longer than others, isolated in regions where survival remains possible. The species, as a whole, does not disappear at once, but fades, its presence becoming less visible until it is no longer detected at all. And even then, the record is incomplete. Fossils capture only fragments, moments preserved under specific conditions. The absence of evidence does not confirm the absence of life, only the absence of preservation. A species may continue beyond the point where it is last recorded, existing quietly in places that leave no trace behind. At the same time, transformation continues. As conditions change, some forms of life adapt, shifting gradually into new variations that may no longer be recognized as the same. The boundary between disappearance and change becomes difficult to define. What appears as an ending may, in some cases, be part of a longer transition, where one form gives way to another, without a clear dividing line. This introduces a different way of understanding extinction, not as a sudden event, but as a process that unfolds over extended periods, shaped by environmental change, competition, and adaptation. The moments we identify as extinction events may represent only the most visible points within these longer patterns, where changes become noticeable enough to be recorded. The idea of an ending begins to soften. It no longer holds the same sense of finality, but becomes part of a continuum where life shifts, adjusts, and sometimes fades in ways that are not immediately clear. The absence we observe is not always a single moment, but the result of many smaller changes accumulating over time. This does not diminish the reality of loss. Species do disappear, ecosystems do change, and the world does not remain the same. But the way these changes occur may be more gradual, more complex, than the sharp boundaries we tend to draw. And within this complexity, something else becomes apparent. Survival and extinction are not opposites, but parts of the same process. As some forms decline, others adapt. As environments shift, life responds, not always in ways that are immediately visible, but in patterns that extend across time. The Jurassic world, like all periods, existed within this flow. Its life forms were not fixed, but part of ongoing processes that did not begin or end in clear moments. What we see as disappearance may be only the point where visibility ends, not necessarily where existence ceased. As this understanding settles, the idea of endings becomes less certain. It becomes something we recognize only after it has already passed, after the traces have stopped appearing, after the patterns have shifted beyond what we can follow. And from this uncertainty, a deeper question begins to emerge. If extinction is not always a clear boundary, if the record itself is incomplete, then how much of the Jurassic world remains hidden from us? How much of it existed beyond what was preserved, beyond what can now be reconstructed, waiting quietly in the spaces where the record falls silent? What we know of the Jurassic world feels substantial, grounded in discoveries that have been carefully studied and arranged into a coherent picture. Fossils fill museum halls, scientific models reconstruct entire ecosystems, and the past begins to feel accessible, almost familiar. But beneath this sense of understanding lies a quieter reality, one that expands far beyond what has been found. Most of the Jurassic world has never been discovered, not because it does not exist, but because it was never preserved, or remains hidden beyond our reach. The process of fossilization is rare, requiring precise conditions that occur only in limited environments. For every organism that becomes part of the record, countless others vanish without leaving any trace behind. Entire landscapes have been lost to time. Forests that once stretched across vast regions have eroded, their remains scattered or dissolved. Oceans have shifted, carrying sediments that buried and destroyed evidence of what once lived within them. Layers of rock that might hold answers lie deep beneath the surface, inaccessible without excavation that may never occur. Even in places where fossils are found, discovery depends on chance. A single exposed rock face, a fracture in the earth, a moment where conditions reveal what was hidden for millions of years. Without these rare alignments, the past remains sealed, its details locked away beyond observation. This introduces a quiet imbalance. What we see is not a complete record, but a selection shaped by circumstance. Certain regions are well represented, while others remain almost entirely unknown. Certain types of organisms are preserved more easily, while others leave little to no evidence behind. The picture we construct is influenced as much by what can be found as by what once existed. And within this limitation, something deeper begins to emerge. The absence is not empty. It is filled with possibility, with forms of life, ecosystems, and interactions that may have played a significant role, yet remain entirely invisible to us. The Jurassic world, as we understand it, may represent only a small portion of what was truly there. There may have been species that evolved along paths we have never traced, ecosystems that functioned in ways we have never considered, environments that left no lasting mark in the geological record. Their existence is not confirmed, but neither is it impossible. It rests within the space between what is known and what cannot be recovered. This realization does not weaken our understanding, but reframes it. Knowledge becomes something partial, shaped by discovery but always extending beyond it. The past is not fully revealed, but partially illuminated, with vast regions remaining in shadow. The scale of what is missing begins to feel immense, not in a way that overwhelms, but in a way that deepens curiosity. Each discovery becomes not just an addition, but a reminder of how much remains unseen. The more we uncover, the more apparent the gaps become. And in those gaps, the Jurassic world continues to exist, not as a complete image, but as something fragmented, layered, and open-ended. It invites a different kind of attention, one that does not seek to close the picture, but to explore its edges, to consider what lies beyond what can be directly observed. As this sense of absence settles, the question shifts once more, not only what has been found, but what might still be revealed. Because even within these limits, new methods are emerging, new ways of looking at what remains, offering the possibility that some of what has been hidden may not be entirely beyond reach. The story does not end with what is missing. It continues with the tools we use to search, the ways we refine our view, and the quiet possibility that the past, though incomplete, may still have more to reveal than we have yet imagined. What remains hidden does not always stay beyond reach. As the limits of discovery become clearer, new ways of looking begin to emerge, methods that do not simply uncover more fossils, but reveal more from what has already been found. The fragments themselves have not changed, but the way they are seen continues to evolve, opening details that once remained invisible. Advanced imaging allows scientists to examine structures without disturbing them, scanning beneath the surface of rock to detect patterns too fine to notice before. Layers within fossils become visible, revealing internal forms that were once sealed away. What once appeared as solid stone begins to unfold into something more intricate, carrying information that was always present but never accessible. Chemical analysis adds another dimension. Traces of elements, preserved at microscopic levels, can hint at biological processes that no longer exist in visible form. Subtle differences in composition suggest how tissues may have been structured, how environments may have influenced development, how conditions shifted over time. These signals are quiet, requiring careful interpretation, yet they expand the range of what can be known. In some cases, remnants of soft tissue leave faint impressions, not complete enough to recreate fully, but sufficient to suggest complexity beyond bone. These discoveries do not provide certainty, but they challenge assumptions, showing that the fossil record may hold more detail than previously believed. Digital modeling brings these elements together, allowing scientists to reconstruct movement, test structural possibilities, and explore how organisms may have functioned within their environments. These models do not recreate reality exactly, but they provide a space where ideas can be examined, where different interpretations can be compared and refined. What becomes clear through these tools is not a final picture, but a deepening one. Each new method adds layers, revealing details that complicate the image rather than simplify it. The Jurassic world does not become clearer in a straightforward way. It becomes more intricate, more nuanced, more difficult to define in a single form. There is a quiet shift in expectation. Discovery is no longer seen as a path toward closure, but as a process that continually expands the scope of what is unknown. Each answer leads to new questions. Each detail opens further possibilities. The past does not settle into clarity, but unfolds into greater complexity. This does not diminish progress. It transforms it. Understanding grows, but it does not reach a point of completion. Instead, it becomes an ongoing exploration, where certainty is replaced by refinement, and knowledge is shaped by continuous adjustment. The tools themselves become part of the story, not just instruments of discovery, but extensions of perception. They allow us to see beyond what was once visible, yet they also reveal how much remains beyond reach. The more closely we examine the past, the more we recognize its depth, its resistance to being fully understood. And within this process, a different kind of awareness begins to form. The Jurassic world is not a fixed image waiting to be uncovered, but a shifting landscape of interpretation, where each new perspective alters the whole. As this expanded view settles, attention begins to turn inward, toward the meaning of all that has been revealed and all that remains uncertain. Because the question is no longer only what the Jurassic world was, but how we come to understand it at all. The tools have changed what can be seen, but they have also changed the nature of the mystery itself. And in doing so, they prepare the way for a final reflection, one that looks beyond discovery and into the deeper question of what it means to know a world that can never be fully recovered. As the fragments accumulate and the methods refine, there is a quiet expectation that the picture will eventually come together, that with enough time, enough discovery, enough detail, the Jurassic world will reveal itself completely. It feels natural to believe that knowledge moves toward completion, that uncertainty is only temporary, something that fades as understanding grows. But the deeper this world is examined, the more that expectation begins to shift. Each layer that becomes visible does not close the gaps, it reveals them more clearly. Each answer carries with it new questions, not smaller than before, but often larger, extending further beyond what can be resolved. The sense of progress remains, yet it does not lead to a final point. The Jurassic world does not settle into a finished image. It resists that kind of closure. It exists as something that can be approached, described, interpreted, but never fully contained within a single understanding. What we build from evidence is always partial, always shaped by what is available and what is missing. This does not mean that knowledge fails. It means that knowledge has boundaries, and those boundaries are not flaws, but part of the nature of studying something so distant in time. The past is not preserved in full. It reaches us in fragments, in signals that require interpretation, in patterns that can be followed but not completed. There is a quiet shift in perspective here. Instead of seeking a final version of the Jurassic world, it becomes possible to see it as something that remains open, something that continues to exist just beyond the edges of what we can describe. The unknown is not a space waiting to be filled, but a space that remains, even as understanding grows. This creates a different kind of relationship with the past, one that does not depend on certainty, but on exploration. The process of learning becomes part of the experience itself, not a path toward an endpoint, but a way of moving through layers of possibility. What we know is real, grounded in evidence, shaped by careful study, but it is not complete. And what remains unknown is not empty, but filled with potential. with variations, with details that may never be recovered. The Jurassic world exists between these two states, known and unknown, visible and hidden. The more closely it is examined, the more it reveals its resistance to simplification. It cannot be reduced to a single narrative without losing something essential. It cannot be fully reconstructed without leaving parts behind. It is, by its nature, unfinished in our understanding. And within that incompleteness, something unexpected begins to emerge. A sense that the mystery itself is not something to be resolved, but something to be experienced. The gaps, the uncertainties, the unanswered questions, they do not diminish the world, they give it depth. The idea of complete understanding begins to feel less necessary, not because it is unattainable, but because it may not be the point. The Jurassic world does not require full clarity to be meaningful. It exists as something that can be approached, explored, and reflected upon without ever being fully defined. This realization settles slowly, without force. The need for resolution softens, replaced by a quieter sense of curiosity. The world remains, not as a finished picture, but as something that continues to unfold in thought, shaped by each new discovery and each new question. And as this perspective takes hold, the focus begins to shift once more. Away from what the Jurassic world was, and toward how it is imagined, how the unknown influences the images we create, how the boundaries of knowledge shape the way we see the past. Because if the world itself resists being fully known, then what we carry forward is not only evidence, but interpretation. And within that interpretation, there may be more of us than we realize, quietly shaping the image of a world that remains just beyond our reach, even now, in every attempt to understand it. Time, as we experience it, moves in ways that feel familiar and contained. Days pass, seasons shift, years accumulate, all within a scale that can be sensed, remembered, and understood. But the Jurassic world did not unfold within this kind of time. It existed within durations so vast that they resist any direct feeling, stretching far beyond the limits of human perception. The Jurassic period lasted for millions of years, a span so large that it cannot be held in a single thought. When we speak of it, it is often reduced to a single name, a single chapter in Earth's history, as though it were one continuous moment. But this simplification hides something essential. The Jurassic was not one world. It was many, changing slowly, continuously, across a depth of time that cannot be easily imagined. When this past is presented, it is often compressed. Scenes flow into one another, creatures appear in constant motion, environments remain stable within the frame. The effect is seamless, creating the impression of a world that existed all at once, fully formed and unchanging. It feels immediate, as though everything happened together, within a span that could be observed. But this sense of continuity is not the same as reality. What appears as a single moment is actually a sequence of countless moments, each separated by time so gradual it becomes invisible. Landscapes shifted, climates adjusted, species evolved, all at a pace that did not disrupt the surface, but quietly reshaped it. If one could move through the Jurassic not in years, but in millions of years, the changes would become clear. Coastlines would drift, forests would transform, species would appear and fade. Yet within any single lifetime, these changes would remain unnoticed. The world would feel stable, even as it moved through continuous transformation. This creates a subtle illusion. By compressing time, we create a sense of clarity, a feeling that the Jurassic can be understood as a single, unified state. But in doing so, we lose the depth of what it truly was. The continuity we see is not a reflection of stillness, but of change too slow to perceive. There was no single Jurassic moment, no fixed point where everything aligned into one complete picture. Instead, there was an ongoing process, a flow of time within which countless variations existed. Each moment slightly different from the last, each one part of a sequence that never paused. The creatures we imagine did not all exist together in the same way we often depict. Some lived millions of years apart, separated by spans of time that exceed the entire history of human civilization. And yet, within our understanding, they are placed side by side, their differences compressed into a single scene. This is not incorrect, but it is incomplete. It reflects the limits of perception, the need to simplify what cannot be easily grasped. Time becomes something we shape, arranging it into forms that feel understandable, even when they no longer represent the full scale of what occurred. And as this realization begins to settle, the nature of the Jurassic world shifts once more. It is no longer a place that can be captured in a single image, but a sequence of worlds, unfolding one after another, each connected, yet never identical. The weight of this time does not overwhelm, but expands the sense of what the past contains. It invites a slower kind of thinking, one that does not rush to define, but allows the scale to be felt, even if it cannot be fully understood. And from this expanded sense of time, another layer begins to emerge, because just as time has been compressed into something familiar, so too has space. The world itself, vast and varied, has been shaped into something more contained than it truly was, waiting quietly to be seen again in its full scale. Once time stretches beyond what can be easily felt, space begins to follow. The Jurassic world is often imagined as a single, continuous landscape, where creatures move freely across forests, plains, and coastlines that seem connected in a seamless whole. The boundaries feel close, the distance is manageable, as though the entire planet could be observed within a single view. But the Earth was never small. Even in the Jurassic, it extended across vast distances, shaped by oceans, land masses, and climates that separated regions in ways that were not easily crossed. What appears unified in our imagination was, in reality, divided into countless environments, each with its own conditions, its own patterns, its own forms of life. A forest in one region did not necessarily resemble a forest in another. The presence of water, the composition of the soil, the movement of air, all contributed to differences that shaped how life developed. Creatures adapted to these conditions, becoming suited to the specific environments they inhabited, often remaining within those boundaries for their entire existence. It becomes possible, then, to imagine two individuals of the same species, living at the same time, yet separated by distances so great they would never encounter one another. Oceans stretched between continents, inland barriers divided regions, climates created zones where survival required different adaptations. The world was connected, but not in a way that allowed for constant interaction. This introduces a quieter form of isolation. Not absolute separation, but enough distance to create variation. Populations evolving along different paths, shaped by the conditions of their immediate surroundings. The Jurassic world was not a single, cohesive environment, but a mosaic of ecosystems, each existing alongside others, yet distinct in its own way. Modern representations often compress these differences. They bring together creatures and environments that may have been separated by vast distances, placing them within the same scene for the sake of clarity. The result is a world that feels unified, but does not fully reflect the scale at which it existed. In reality, movement across the planet would have been limited by geography. Migration, where it occurred, followed specific routes, shaped by land connections and environmental conditions. Many creatures would have lived and died within a relatively confined range, their experience of the world defined by the space immediately around them. This does not diminish the scale of their existence, but reframes it. The Jurassic world was immense, not only in size, but in variation. Each region carried its own patterns, its own rhythms, forming a network of environments that were connected in structure, yet separate in experience. And within this vastness, there is a kind of quiet distance, not empty, but filled with life that remains unseen from any single perspective. The idea of a unified world begins to dissolve, replaced by the understanding that what we imagine as one place was, in truth, many places at once. The creatures we follow do not represent the whole. They are part of a larger system, one that extends beyond what can be easily visualized. Their lives unfold within specific regions, shaped by conditions that may not exist elsewhere, separated from other forms of life by barriers that remain invisible in simplified images. As this sense of scale settles, the Jurassic world becomes less like a single stage and more like a collection of worlds, overlapping in time but divided in space. Each one complete in itself, yet only a part of the whole. And with both time and space expanded, another layer begins to emerge. Because the way we imagine this world is not only shaped by what existed, but by how we interpret it. The boundaries we draw, the connections we assume, all reflect the way the mind organizes what it cannot fully grasp, quietly reshaping the past into something that feels closer, simpler, and more familiar than it truly was. As time stretches and space expands, something else begins to come into focus. Something far closer than the distant past itself. The way the Jurassic world is seen is not shaped by evidence alone, but by the mind that receives it. Every fragment, every fossil, every reconstruction passes through a layer of interpretation before it becomes part of what we understand. The human mind does not hold complexity easily. It looks for patterns, for structure, for forms that can be recognized and remembered. When information is incomplete, it does not remain empty for long. It is filled, often unconsciously, with what feels familiar. Shapes become clearer, movements more defined, environments more coherent than the fragments alone would allow. This tendency does not arise from error, but from necessity. Without it, the past would remain too fragmented to grasp at all. The mind builds connections, extending what is known into what can be imagined. It creates continuity where gaps exist, forming a world that can be visualized, even when parts of it are uncertain. But in doing so, something subtle occurs. The Jurassic world begins to take on qualities that do not originate from the past itself, but from the present perspective. Modern animals influence how ancient ones are seen. Current environments shape how prehistoric landscapes are imagined. Even emotional tones, the sense of danger, calm, or tension, are often reflections of how we experience the world today. This does not mean the reconstruction is false, but it means it is not neutral. It carries the imprint of the observer, shaped by expectations, experiences, and the limits of perception. The image becomes a blend of evidence and interpretation, where it is not always clear where one ends and the other begins. There is a quiet familiarity in how the Jurassic is often presented. It feels understandable, organized, almost intuitive. Creatures behave in ways that make sense to us. Environments follow patterns we recognize. Interactions unfold in ways that feel logical. But this familiarity may not come from the past itself. It may come from the mind shaping the unknown into something that can be held. The more this is considered, the more the image begins to shift. What once appeared as a direct window into the past starts to feel like a reflection, shaped as much by the observer as by the observed. The Jurassic world becomes something interpreted, not simply revealed. This introduces a deeper layer of uncertainty, not about the evidence, but about how it is understood. It is no longer enough to ask what the past was like. The question extends further, into how the process of understanding shapes what is seen. The mind does not only receive the past, it participates in its reconstruction, arranging fragments into patterns, selecting interpretations that feel consistent, building a narrative that can be followed. This process is essential, yet it carries influence that is often unnoticed. And within that realization, a subtle shift takes place. The Jurassic world becomes less fixed, less certain, not because the evidence is unreliable, but because the act of interpretation is always present. What we see is shaped by how we see. This does not remove meaning. It deepens it. It invites a more careful awareness, one that recognizes the role of perception in shaping understanding. The past is not only something that is uncovered, but something that is constructed through the interaction between evidence and mind. As this perspective settles, another question begins to form, one that moves beyond interpretation itself. If the mind shapes what can be understood, then there may be aspects of the Jurassic world that remain beyond that reach, not only undiscovered, but beyond the limits of what can be fully known, waiting in a space where evidence and perception can no longer meet. Everything we know about the Jurassic world begins with evidence, with what has been preserved, discovered, and carefully studied over time. It feels solid, dependable, built on observation rather than imagination. Fossils, rock layers, chemical traces, all form a foundation that allows the past to be explored with a sense of confidence. And yet, even this foundation carries limits that are easy to overlook. Evidence does not exist everywhere. It appears only where conditions allowed it to survive, where time did not erase it completely. For every detail that reaches us, countless others have been lost, not recorded, not preserved, not available to be studied. What we see is shaped not only by what existed, but by what endured. This creates a boundary that cannot be crossed. Knowledge extends only as far as evidence allows, and beyond that, there is silence. Not an empty silence, but one filled with possibilities that cannot be confirmed or denied. It is a space where life may have existed in forms and patterns that left no trace behind. The absence of evidence often feels like an absence of existence, but this is not necessarily the case. Entire ecosystems could have thrived in environments where preservation was unlikely. Behaviors may have shaped survival in ways that left no physical imprint. Interactions between species, subtle and continuous, may have defined the world without ever becoming part of the record. This introduces a quiet tension within understanding. The more carefully the evidence is examined, the more clearly its limits appear. Each discovery provides insight, yet also highlights what remains unknown. The boundaries do not disappear with progress. They become more visible. And within these boundaries, interpretation continues. Scientists work within what is available, drawing connections, building models, extending understanding as far as the evidence supports. This process is grounded, careful, and always aware of its own limits. It does not claim certainty where it cannot be established, but it also does not ignore the possibilities that lie beyond. There is a balance here, one that does not diminish the strength of science, but defines it. Knowledge is built from what can be tested and observed, yet it remains open to revision, aware that new discoveries may alter what was once considered complete. The Jurassic world, then, is shaped by both presence and absence. What is known provides structure, but what is unknown defines its edges. It is not a fully illuminated landscape, but one where certain areas are clear, while others remain in shadow. This shadow is not a weakness. It is a reflection of the nature of deep time, where preservation is rare and completeness is unlikely. The past does not offer itself in full. It provides fragments, and from those fragments, understanding is formed. As this realization settles, the idea of certainty begins to change. It becomes less about having complete answers and more about recognizing the limits within which answers can exist. The boundaries of evidence do not close off inquiry. They shape it, guiding where questions can be asked and where they must remain open. And from this boundary, another thought begins to emerge. If evidence defines what can be known, then there may be questions that extend beyond it, questions that cannot be fully resolved, not because they lack importance, but because the means to answer them no longer exist. The Jurassic world remains within reach, yet never entirely within grasp. And as the limits of evidence become clearer, the nature of understanding begins to shift once more, moving toward the possibility that some aspects of the past may remain unanswered, not temporarily, but permanently, existing at the edge of knowledge where curiosity continues, even without resolution. Even with careful study and growing detail, the Jurassic world continues to hold questions that do not settle into clear answers. They remain present, not as gaps waiting to be filled, but as open spaces that extend beyond the reach of what can be confirmed. These questions do not fade with time or effort. In many ways, they become more defined as understanding deepens. There are uncertainties that begin at the surface. The exact colors of dinosaurs, for example, remain largely unknown. Patterns may be suggested through rare evidence, but the full range of appearance, the subtle variations that would have shaped how these creatures were seen within their environments, cannot be fully restored. What we imagine is guided by possibility, but never fixed by certainty. Behavior carries even greater uncertainty. How creatures interacted, how they communicated, how they responded to changes in their environment. These details are rarely preserved. They must be inferred, carefully, from traces that provide only partial insight. The result is not a single answer, but a range of possibilities, each one supported in part, yet never fully confirmed. Ecosystems, too, remain incomplete in their understanding. The relationships between species, the balance of populations, the subtle dynamics that allowed stability to persist, all exist within patterns that can be suggested, but not entirely reconstructed. The structure is visible, but the full depth of interaction remains beyond direct observation. Even evolutionary pathways, which can be traced through fossils and genetic connections, carry uncertainties. The transitions between forms are not always continuous in the record. There are gaps, periods where the sequence is interrupted, leaving room for interpretation. The path from one form to another can be outlined, but not always fully detailed. What becomes clear is that these questions are not temporary. They are not simply waiting for the right discovery to resolve them. In some cases, the evidence that would provide clarity no longer exists. It was never preserved, or it has been lost over time, leaving no trace behind. This introduces a different way of seeing these uncertainties. They are not failures of knowledge, but features of it. They define the limits within which understanding can grow, shaping the way inquiry continues. Instead of leading toward closure, they open paths that extend outward, inviting exploration rather than resolution. The idea of an answer begins to change. It is no longer something final, something that ends the question. Instead, it becomes part of an ongoing process, where each new insight adds depth, but does not remove the need to ask further. There is a quiet freedom in this perspective. It allows curiosity to remain active, not constrained by the expectation of completion. The Jurassic world becomes a field of inquiry that continues to evolve, shaped by both what can be discovered and what cannot. This does not diminish the value of knowledge. It deepens it. Each question carries meaning, not only in what it seeks to uncover, but in the way it expands understanding, even without a final answer. The process itself becomes significant, a way of engaging with the past that does not depend on certainty. As these open questions accumulate, they begin to form a pattern of their own. A recognition that the past is not something that can be fully resolved, but something that remains in motion within thought, shaped by evidence, interpretation, and the limits that define both. And from this growing awareness, another layer begins to emerge. If some questions do not have endings, then perhaps the framework used to understand them is not fixed either. Perhaps the way we approach the past, the structure of interpretation itself, may need to shift, adapting to a reality where not everything can be contained within clear answers, and where understanding continues without reaching a final conclusion. The idea of understanding often carries a quiet expectation that knowledge moves toward completion, that with enough time and effort, a clear and stable picture will eventually emerge. It feels natural to believe that the Jurassic world, like any subject of study, can be fully known, its details arranged into a final form that no longer changes. But the deeper this world is explored, the more that expectation begins to soften. Understanding does not remain still. It shifts, adjusts, and redefines itself as new evidence appears and new perspectives take shape. What once seemed certain can be reconsidered, not because it was incorrect, but because it was incomplete. Each discovery does not simply add to what is known, it can alter the meaning of what was already understood. This creates a landscape of knowledge that is not fixed, but fluid. The Jurassic world is not revealed all at once, nor does it settle into a single unchanging image. It moves, quietly, through stages of interpretation, where each version reflects the best understanding available at that time, yet remains open to change. There is a subtle tension within this process. Certainty feels stable, reassuring, something that allows understanding to rest. But in a world shaped by fragments and interpretation, certainty becomes difficult to hold. It appears briefly, then shifts as new information emerges, revealing itself as temporary rather than permanent. This does not weaken knowledge. It defines its nature. To understand something as distant as the Jurassic world is not to reach a final answer, but to participate in an ongoing process of refinement. The picture grows clearer in some areas, more complex in others, always adjusting as new details come into view. The expectation of a fixed understanding begins to give way to something different. Knowledge becomes dynamic, shaped by change rather than resisting it. What matters is not the permanence of a conclusion, but the ability to adapt, to reconsider, to allow the picture to evolve without losing its coherence. There is a quiet realization within this shift. The value of understanding may not lie in its final form, but in its movement, in the way it responds to new information, in the way it continues to expand rather than close. The Jurassic world remains accessible, but never fully contained, always extending beyond what is currently known. This creates a different relationship with the past. It is no longer something that can be captured and held in a single form, but something that unfolds through time, shaped by discovery, interpretation, and revision. The process becomes as important as the result, perhaps even more so. Certainty, in this context, begins to feel less essential. It becomes one stage within a larger progression, useful but not permanent. What replaces it is a deeper awareness, an understanding that remains open, flexible, and responsive to change. The Jurassic world does not resist being known, but it does resist being finalized. It remains in motion, not in its existence, but in the way it is understood. Each new insight shifts the balance, revealing connections that were not previously visible, altering the structure of what seemed stable. And within this movement, something else becomes clear. Understanding is not a destination that can be reached and completed. It is a continuous process, one that does not end, but evolves alongside the questions that guide it. As this perspective settles, the pieces of the narrative begin to draw together. The fragments of evidence, the limits of perception, the presence of uncertainty, all connect within a larger framework. One that does not seek to resolve the mystery, but to hold it, to explore it, and to recognize that within the changing nature of understanding itself lies the deepest reflection of a world that can never remain still. The Jurassic world no longer moves through time, yet it continues to change. Not in the way it once did, shaped by shifting land and evolving life, but in the way it is understood. Each discovery, each reinterpretation, each new method of observation quietly alters the picture, not replacing the past, but reshaping how it appears. What feels stable today may not remain so. A fossil once interpreted in one way may be seen differently under new analysis. A structure thought to serve a specific function may take on a new meaning when compared with fresh evidence. These changes do not happen all at once. They unfold gradually, adjusting the image in ways that are often subtle, yet deeply significant. The past, in this sense, is not fixed within human knowledge. It is revisited, re-examined, and refined over time. What we call understanding is not a single achievement, but a series of approximations, each one shaped by the tools, perspectives, and information available at that moment. This creates a quiet movement within something that appears still. The Jurassic world does not remain unchanged in thought. It shifts, adapting to the growing depth of what is known. The image becomes more detailed, but also more complex, revealing layers that were not previously visible. There is a subtle difference between what the past was and what it becomes in our understanding. The past itself does not move, but the way it is seen continues to evolve. It is not rewritten in the sense of being altered, but in the sense of being reinterpreted, its meaning expanding as new connections are made. This process does not lead toward a final version. Instead, it creates a sequence of understandings, each one more refined than the last, yet never complete. The Jurassic world we know today is not the same as the one imagined decades ago, and it will not be the same in the future. This introduces a quiet form of uncertainty, not about the existence of the past, but about the permanence of how it is understood. What feels accurate now may one day be reconsidered, not because it was wrong, but because it was part of an ongoing process that has not yet reached its limits. There is something almost paradoxical in this. The more we learn, the more the image changes. Knowledge does not settle into stillness, but continues to move, revealing that understanding is not about fixing the past in place, but about following its complexity as it unfolds. This movement invites a different way of thinking. Instead of holding on to a single version, it becomes possible to see understanding as something that grows, something that remains open to revision. The Jurassic world becomes less like a completed picture and more like a landscape that is continuously revealed from new perspectives. And within this shifting landscape, something deeper begins to emerge. The recognition that the past is not only shaped by evidence, but by interpretation, by the ways in which gaps are filled, connections are made, and meaning is constructed. Because even as knowledge expands, there remain spaces that cannot be fully reached. Areas where evidence is limited, where questions remain open, where the image cannot be completed through data alone. And it is within these spaces that another element begins to take form, something that does not replace science, but works alongside it. Imagination, not as invention, but as a way of extending beyond what can be directly known, quietly shaping how the Jurassic world is brought into view when evidence alone is not enough to carry it further. When evidence reaches its limits, something else begins to move quietly into place. Not to replace what is known, but to extend it, to give shape to what cannot be directly observed. This is where imagination enters, not as something separate from science, but as something that works alongside it, filling the spaces that evidence alone cannot fully illuminate. Every reconstruction of the Jurassic world carries this presence. Bones provide structure, geological layers offer context, chemical traces hint at processes, but none of these elements can complete the image on their own. There are always gaps, spaces where detail is missing, where connections must be formed without direct confirmation. It is within these spaces that imagination begins to act. This does not mean that anything can be imagined freely. The process remains grounded, guided by what is known, shaped by constraints that prevent it from drifting too far from evidence. Imagination does not create without direction. It works within boundaries, extending from what can be supported toward what can be reasonably suggested. It allows movement to be visualized where only structure exists. It gives texture to surfaces where only outlines remain. It brings environments into form where only fragments of information are available. Without it, the past would remain distant, abstract, difficult to engage with in any meaningful way. And yet, there is a subtle tension within this process. The same ability that allows the past to be visualized can also influence how it is perceived. Imagination does not only fill gaps, it shapes them. It introduces elements that feel familiar, patterns that align with expectation, interpretations that make the unknown easier to understand. The line between reconstruction and interpretation begins to soften. What appears as a direct representation of the past may carry elements that originate from the present, from the way the mind organizes incomplete information into something coherent. The image becomes a blend, where evidence and imagination are intertwined in ways that are not always visible. This does not make the reconstruction unreliable, but it does make it complex. It requires awareness, an understanding that what is seen is not only what was, but also how it has been interpreted. The Jurassic world is brought into view through this interaction, shaped by both what is known and how it is extended. There is value in this balance. Without imagination, the past remains fragmented. Without evidence, it becomes ungrounded. Together, they allow a form of understanding that is both structured and expressive, capable of approaching something that cannot be fully recovered. The key lies not in separating them completely, but in recognizing their roles. Evidence anchors the image, providing limits that keep it connected to reality. Imagination expands it, allowing those limits to be explored, to be shaped into something that can be perceived and reflected upon. As this relationship becomes clearer, the Jurassic world begins to feel different once again. Not less real, but more layered, more dependent on the interaction between discovery and interpretation. It is not simply uncovered, but brought into view through a process that involves both precision and creativity. And within this process, another realization begins to form. The way we see the Jurassic world is not only shaped by what is found, but by how it is imagined. The image that emerges is influenced by both, carrying traces of evidence and interpretation within it. As this understanding settles, the focus begins to shift toward what remains, toward the image we carry forward, shaped by knowledge and imagination together. And within that image, the question begins to deepen, not just what the Jurassic world was, but what it has become in the way we continue to see it today. The Jurassic world no longer exists in the way it once did, yet it has not disappeared. It continues, not in landscapes or living forms, but in thought, in memory, in the stories we return to again and again. It moves quietly through culture, shaped by each generation that encounters it, reinterprets it, and carries it forward in new ways. What we imagine today is not the same as what was imagined before. Earlier visions of the Jurassic were simpler, shaped by limited evidence and guided by familiar patterns. As knowledge expanded, those images began to change. Details were added, forms refined, environments reconsidered. Each shift did not erase the past understanding, but layered over it, creating a sequence of interpretations that reflect both discovery and perspective. The Jurassic world becomes, in this sense, a living narrative. Not because the past itself is changing, but because the way it is understood continues to evolve. It exists in books, in images, in conversations, each one carrying a version shaped by its time. What is remembered is not only what was, but how it has been seen. This introduces a quiet continuity between past and present. The Jurassic is not separate from us. not confined to a distant time that has no connection to now. It is part of an ongoing process, where knowledge, imagination, and curiosity intersect, shaping how the world is understood across generations. There is something almost reflective in this process. The way the Jurassic world is imagined reveals not only information about the past, but about the present as well. The questions that are asked, the details that are emphasized, the interpretations that are chosen, all carry traces of the perspective from which they arise. This does not distort the past, but it does shape its presence. The Jurassic world becomes a space where evidence and meaning meet, where discovery is combined with interpretation, where what is known is extended into what can be felt and understood. And within this, a different kind of legacy begins to emerge. The importance of the Jurassic world is not only in what it was, but in what it continues to inspire. Curiosity does not end with discovery. It deepens, expands, moves into new questions, new perspectives, new ways of seeing. The past becomes part of an ongoing dialogue, one that does not conclude, but continues to unfold. Each generation adds to it, not by completing it, but by extending it, carrying forward the sense of wonder that first brought it into view. There is no single version that defines it completely. Instead, there are many, each one shaped by the knowledge and imagination of its time. Together, they form a broader understanding, not fixed, but evolving, reflecting both the past and the present at once. This continuity does not resolve the mystery, it preserves it. The Jurassic world remains something that can be approached, explored, and reflected upon, without ever becoming fully contained within a single interpretation. As this realization settles, the sense of distance begins to soften. The past feels less separate, less unreachable, not because it has changed, but because it continues to exist within thought, carried forward through the act of understanding itself. And from this quiet continuity, the narrative begins to move toward its final shape. Not toward an ending, but toward a reflection, where the story does not seek to close, but to settle, allowing the mystery to remain, not as something unresolved, but as something that continues, quietly, beyond the need for conclusion. By the time the Jurassic world is assembled in the mind, it often feels complete. The creatures have form, the landscapes have depth, the interactions seem to follow a clear and understandable rhythm. There is a sense of coherence, a quiet confidence that what is being seen reflects something close to what once existed. The image holds together, and in that stability, certainty begins to form. But this certainty does not emerge all at once. It is built gradually, layer by layer, from fragments that are interpreted, connected, and shaped into a narrative that feels whole. Fossils provide structure, reconstruction fills in detail, perception organizes the image, and absence is quietly smoothed over by what seems most reasonable. Each part contributes, not to a false picture, but to a partial one that feels complete. The mind does not easily hold fragments without connection. It seeks continuity, drawing lines between separate pieces until they form a single, flowing image. In this process, gaps become less visible. The edges soften, the uncertainties recede, and what remains is something that can be understood without difficulty. This is where certainty begins to take shape, not as a direct reflection of complete evidence, but as a result of clarity within the narrative itself. When the story holds together, when each element appears to fit within a larger structure, it creates the impression that nothing essential is missing. Yet beneath this impression, the limitations remain. Fossils still preserve only fragments, reconstruction still relies on interpretation, perception still shapes what is seen, and absence still defines the boundaries of what can be known. These elements do not disappear as understanding grows. They remain present, even when they are no longer visible within the image. This introduces a subtle shift in perspective. The question is no longer only what the Jurassic world was like, but how the image of it has been formed. What gives it coherence? What allows it to feel complete? What transforms fragments into something that appears whole? The answer does not lie in a single source, but in the interaction between evidence and interpretation. The clarity of the image comes not only from what is known, but from how the unknown is shaped into something that can be understood. It is a process that creates meaning, but also creates a sense of closure that may not fully reflect the depth of what is missing. This does not make the understanding unreliable, but it does make it delicate. The certainty it produces is not fixed. It rests on a structure that can shift as new information appears, as perspectives change, as the boundaries of knowledge become more visible once again. There is something almost quiet in this realization. Certainty does not disappear, but it becomes lighter, less absolute. It is recognized as something that arises from the way the past is organized in thought, rather than from the complete presence of all that once existed. And within this awareness, the Jurassic world begins to feel different. Not less real, but less contained. The image remains, but it is no longer seen as final. It becomes one version among many possible interpretations, each shaped by the same interplay of evidence and imagination. As this sense of certainty begins to loosen, another layer begins to emerge. A recognition that what is not present, what remains unspoken within the record, may hold as much meaning as what has been reconstructed. Because beyond the fragments and the interpretations, there is a silence that remains. Not empty, but filled with what cannot be fully known. And as the narrative continues, attention begins to move toward that silence, toward the possibility that meaning may not lie only in the answers we construct, but in the spaces where those answers cannot reach. Between every fossil, between every layer of rock, there is a space that remains unfilled. It is easy to overlook, because attention is naturally drawn to what is present, to what can be seen, measured, and described. The evidence feels solid, something that can be held onto, something that forms the structure of understanding. But what lies between these fragments is not empty. It is a silence that carries its own kind of presence. This silence is shaped by what has not been preserved. Entire species may have lived and disappeared without leaving a trace. Behaviors that define survival may have unfolded countless times, yet left no physical imprint. Ecosystems may have existed in delicate balance, only to be erased by processes that did not allow their details to remain. What is missing is not necessarily small. It may be vast, extending far beyond what can now be recovered. The fossil record, for all its value, does not capture continuity. It offers moments scattered across time, separated by intervals that may span thousands or millions of years. Between those moments, life continued. It moved, adapted, interacted, changed. Yet those movements are not directly visible. They exist within the gaps, within the stretches of time where no evidence remains. It is within these gaps that the sense of silence begins to deepen, not as an absence of information, but as a boundary that defines how far understanding can extend. The known does not exist without the unknown surrounding it. Each discovery is framed by what cannot be seen, shaped by what has not been preserved. This silence influences interpretation in ways that are often unnoticed. The mind moves across the gaps, connecting fragments, forming continuity where none is directly recorded. It creates a flow between separate points, allowing the past to feel complete, even when large portions remain unseen. But when attention shifts toward the silence itself, something changes. The gaps are no longer simply spaces to be filled. They become part of the structure of understanding, elements that carry meaning not through what they contain, but through what they withhold. There is a quiet realization here. The most important aspects of the Jurassic world may not be those that are clearly visible, but those that remain beyond direct observation. The relationships that cannot be reconstructed, the variations that left no trace, the countless interactions that shaped life without being recorded. These elements exist, not in evidence, but in possibility. This does not make them less real. It makes them less accessible, and in that distance, they take on a different kind of significance. They remind us that the past is not fully captured, that what is known is only part of a larger whole that cannot be entirely reached. The silence becomes active in this sense. It shapes how evidence is understood, how interpretations are formed, how the limits of knowledge are recognized. It is not separate from understanding, but intertwined with it, present in every conclusion that is drawn. As this perspective settles, the need to fill every gap begins to soften. The absence no longer feels like something to overcome, but something to acknowledge. It becomes part of the experience of exploring the past, a reminder that not everything can be recovered, and that meaning does not always come from completion. The Jurassic world, then, exists not only in what has been preserved, but in what has not. It is defined as much by silence as by evidence. by what remains unseen as by what has been revealed. And as this silence is recognized, the narrative begins to shift once more, away from the search for answers and toward a quieter space of reflection, where the story does not seek to resolve what is unknown, but to remain with it, allowing the mystery to continue without the need for closure. As the fragments of the Jurassic world gather in thought, they begin to resemble a story. There are beginnings suggested by origins, continuations shaped by evolution, and endings marked by disappearance. The structure feels familiar, something that can be followed, something that gives shape to what might otherwise remain scattered. And yet, the closer this story is examined, the more it resists becoming complete. Each discovery adds detail, extending the image, refining its edges, filling certain gaps with greater clarity. But with each addition, new spaces appear, areas where questions deepen rather than resolve. The story does not move toward a final form. It expands outward, growing more complex as more is understood. There is no single moment where everything aligns into a complete picture. The fragments remain distinct, connected through interpretation, but never fully merging into a seamless whole. What is known is accurate within its limits, yet those limits prevent the formation of something entirely complete. This creates a different kind of narrative, one that does not follow the structure of a finished story. It has continuity, but not closure. It has meaning, but not finality. The Jurassic world exists within this form as something that can be explored, described, and reflected upon, but not fully assembled. The expectation of completion begins to soften. The idea that one day the past will be entirely understood, that every gap will be filled, that every question will find its answer, becomes less certain. Not because understanding has failed, but because the nature of what is being studied does not allow for that kind of resolution. The past is not preserved in full. It does not offer all of its details at once. It provides fragments, moments, traces that can be followed, but not completed. The story that emerges from these pieces is real, but it is also partial, shaped by what is available and defined by what is not. There is something quiet in this realization. The absence of a complete story does not diminish the meaning of what is known. It changes the way that meaning is held. It becomes something that does not depend on final answers, but on the presence of exploration itself. Each fragment carries its own truth, its own connection to what once existed. Together, they form a structure that can be understood, but not finished. The Jurassic world becomes a collection of these fragments, each one contributing to a larger picture that never fully settles. This incompleteness is not a flaw, it is a reflection of deep time, of processes that extend beyond preservation, beyond observation, beyond the limits of what can be reconstructed. It defines the nature of the past as something that can be approached, but not entirely contained. The story, then, is not something that reaches an ending. It remains open, continuing through each new discovery, each new interpretation, each new question that arises from what has been found. It exists not as a fixed narrative, but as an evolving one, shaped by both knowledge and its limits. And within this openness, there is a sense of continuity. The Jurassic world does not conclude, not in the way a story might. It remains present within thought, within inquiry, within the ongoing process of understanding that never fully arrives at a final point. As this perspective settles, the need for completion begins to fade. What remains is something quieter, something more expansive, a recognition that the story does not need to be finished to hold meaning. And from this recognition, the narrative moves gently toward its final chapter. Not to resolve what has been explored, but to rest within it, to observe what remains when the search for completion is set aside, and the Jurassic world is allowed to exist as it is, unfinished, yet endlessly present. Before there was any thought of understanding, before there were questions, before there was even a mind to ask them, the Jurassic world existed in its own quiet continuity. It did not pause to be observed, did not arrange itself into something that could be explained, did not leave behind traces with the intention of being discovered. It simply unfolded, moment by moment, within the flow of a planet that required no witness. Forests spread and receded, shaped by conditions that shifted slowly over time. Oceans moved across the surface, carrying currents that influenced climates far beyond what could be seen from any single place. Creatures lived within these environments, not as subjects of study, but as parts of a system that operated without reflection. Their lives were not recorded as stories. They were lived, and then they passed, leaving behind only what chance allowed to remain. Nothing within that world needed to be known. The processes that shaped it continued without interruption, guided by forces that did not depend on awareness. Evolution unfolded without intention, ecosystems adjusted without direction, and the balance of life shifted in ways that were neither planned nor remembered. There is a quiet distance in this realization. The Jurassic world was not waiting to be understood. It was not incomplete until it was discovered. It existed fully within its own time, complete in a way that did not require interpretation. What we seek now is not something that was left for us, but something that persisted long before the possibility of being known. This creates a shift in perspective. The past is no longer centered around our ability to study it. It is not defined by what we have uncovered or what we have yet to learn. It exists independently, beyond the reach of observation, beyond the limits of understanding. The sense of importance begins to change. What matters is not whether every detail can be recovered, but that the world itself existed, fully and continuously, without the need to be seen. The processes that shaped it were complete in their own time, requiring no explanation, no interpretation, no memory to give them meaning. And yet, something remains. Not in the form of intention, but in the traces that survived, in the fragments that now allow a distant connection to be formed. These fragments do not represent the whole, but they carry enough to suggest what once was, to provide a glimpse into a world that did not depend on being remembered. The Jurassic world continues, not in its original form, but in the processes that never stopped. The planet still turns, the atmosphere still shifts, life still adapts. The patterns that once shaped that distant time persist, carried forward into the present, in ways that are not always visible, but never truly absent. There is no clear boundary between then and now, only a continuation of processes that extend across time. The past does not end. It becomes part of what follows, shaping it in ways that are often subtle yet always present. This realization settles without urgency. The need to fully understand begins to soften, replaced by an awareness of something larger, something that exists beyond the limits of knowledge. The Jurassic world was never waiting for us. It did not need to be understood to exist. And as this perspective deepens, the sense of separation begins to shift. The distance between past and present becomes less defined, not because they are the same, but because they are connected through processes that continue without interruption. From this quiet connection, the narrative begins to move once more, not toward explanation but toward reflection, toward the ways in which that distant world, though never dependent on us, still reaches into the present, shaping what remains and influencing how it is quietly understood today. What once existed does not remain in its original form, yet it does not vanish completely. The Jurassic world, though distant, has not been entirely left behind. It continues in quieter ways, carried forward through processes that never truly stopped, reshaped over time into the world that now surrounds us. The air that moves across the planet today is not separate from the past. Its composition has shifted, adjusted through countless changes, yet it remains part of a continuous system. The balance of gases, the movement of currents, the exchange between life and atmosphere, all extend back through time, shaped by processes that were active long before the present moment. Life, too, carries this continuity. Modern organisms are not isolated from what came before. They are part of an ongoing lineage, shaped by evolution that never paused. The forms have changed, adapted to new conditions, yet they remain connected through a sequence that reaches into deep time. The distance between what was and what is becomes less defined when seen through this continuity. Even the land itself holds traces of what once existed. The surface has shifted, continents have moved, environments have transformed, yet the structures that define the planet are part of a process that has never fully reset. What appears new is often a rearrangement of what came before, shaped by forces that have been active across vast spans of time. This creates a quiet connection between the Jurassic world and the present, not a direct preservation, but a transformation. The past does not remain unchanged, but it does not disappear entirely. It becomes something else, carried forward through processes that reshape it without removing its influence. There is a subtle shift in how time is perceived within this realization. The boundary between past and present begins to soften. It is no longer a clear division, but a transition, where one state becomes another without a sharp separation. The Jurassic world does not sit entirely apart. It exists within the continuity that leads to now. This does not mean that the past is still here in a recognizable form. The creatures, the environments, the specific conditions of that time have changed beyond direct recognition. But the patterns that shape them remain, carried forward into new expressions, forming the foundation of what exists today. The sense of distance begins to change. The Jurassic world feels less like something completely removed, and more like something that has transformed, its presence subtle but persistent. It is not visible in a direct way, but it can be sensed in the continuity of processes that have never fully ended. This realization brings a different kind of closeness. The past is no longer only something to be studied from afar. It becomes part of the present, not as memory, but as structure, as influence, as a continuation of patterns that extend across time. And within this connection, something deeper begins to settle. The Jurassic world does not need to remain intact to remain relevant. It continues through what it has become, through the ways in which its processes persist, through the subtle echoes that exist within the present. As this perspective holds, the movement of the narrative begins to slow. The questions that once drove it forward begin to quiet, not because they have been answered, but because they no longer need to be resolved in the same way. What remains is not a final explanation, but a sense of continuity, a recognition that the past and present are not entirely separate, but part of the same unfolding process. And from this quiet connection, the narrative moves gently toward its final reflection, where the focus shifts away from what can be known, and toward what remains when the search for answers gives way to something more still. The story does not arrive at an ending. It does not gather itself into a final answer, or settle into a form that feels complete. Instead, it becomes quieter, softer, as though it is no longer trying to move forward, but simply remaining where it has always been. The silence returns. It has been present from the beginning, though it was not always noticed. It exists between the fragments of evidence, within the limits of understanding, around every question that extends beyond what can be answered. It is not empty. It carries within it everything that has been explored, everything that has been considered, and everything that remains beyond reach. The Jurassic world exists within this silence, not as a finished picture, not as a complete story, but as something that continues to rest just beyond the edges of what can be fully understood. The fossils, the reconstructions, the interpretations, they all bring parts of it into view, yet none of them contain it entirely. What remains is always larger than what is known. There is no single version that can hold it. Each attempt to understand reveals something, but also leaves something behind. The more closely it is examined, the more its depth becomes apparent, not through clarity, but through the recognition of what cannot be fully resolved. And within that recognition, the silence becomes something different. It is no longer simply the absence of answers. It becomes a presence of its own, shaped by possibility, by limitation, by the quiet awareness that understanding has boundaries that cannot be crossed. It holds within it the idea that not everything can be translated into clear form, that some aspects of the past remain beyond the structures of explanation. This does not diminish the Jurassic world. It allows it to remain vast. There is a calmness in this realization. The need to complete the story begins to fade, replaced by an acceptance that it was never meant to be fully assembled. The fragments remain, meaningful in themselves, connected yet incomplete, forming something that can be approached but not contained. The silence carries this understanding without needing to explain it. It does not resolve the questions. It does not close the gaps. It simply exists alongside them, steady and unchanged, allowing them to remain open. And within that openness, something continues. The world that once existed does not return, yet it has not disappeared entirely. It remains in fragments, in processes, in echoes that extend into the present. It remains in thought, in imagination, in the quiet act of trying to understand something that cannot be fully known. The silence holds all of this together. It does not separate what is known from what is unknown. It allows them to exist side by side, without forcing them into a single conclusion. It reflects the nature of the past as something that continues to unfold within understanding, even when it cannot be fully reached. There is no final truth that gathers everything into one answer. There is only this space, this presence, this quiet continuity that remains when the search for certainty softens. The Jurassic world does not end here. It does not resolve into clarity or disappear into explanation. It continues. Not in the way it once did, but in the way it is held within thought, within curiosity, within the awareness that something can be real without being fully understood. And as the narrative fades, nothing is concluded. The silence remains, just as it always has, carrying with it everything that has been seen, everything that has been imagined, and everything that still lies beyond. It does not ask to be filled. It simply continues,